Okay, so the game just sucks now. D&D has been officially ruined by WotC, and you're better off just playing anything else at this point, because they have changed the game completely beyond recognition from the previous editions, including the old version of 5e, so don't waste your money, don't waste your time, go anywhere else and don't play D&D because D&D is dead, is maybe what you expect me to say with a video titled like this one. But despite me saying those things, I don't actually think D&D has been ruined, let me make that absolutely clear. And despite D&D getting a lot of hate recently, some of it rightfully so, and despite a considerable portion of the community moving on to other game systems or choosing to not play the new version of D&D, I still wanted to give it a try. So I signed up for a promotional one-shot my local game store was hosting that was put out by WotC, designed to showcase new class features, rules, and get players hyped about the new version of D&D. But I have some notes that I'd like to share with you guys regarding my experience using the new player's handbook, as well as what playing the new character classes felt like. But before we talk about all that, hello, my name is Damon, and I'm a very big fan of D&D, and despite D&D having a lot of blunders recently, I still want to see them land on their feet because, like many of you guys, D&D was the very first game system I ever played, so I have a lot of cherished memories playing this game system and watching other people play this game system, so it has a very special place in my heart. And up until recently, D&D was my most played game system and rule set that I ran the most campaigns for by far. But recently, I've been very curious about the new rules for D&D, as I'm sure many of you are as well, and how they felt in an actual game session, which is why I wanted to experience it as a player rather than a dungeon master, because I mean, let's be honest, the majority of the community are players rather than game masters or dungeon masters. So the adventure I played in was an adventure inspired by and based off of the old school D&D cartoon from the 80s.
Dungeons and Dragons ride!
And yes, that cartoon. And the player characters were characters from the cartoon. And while I have only ever seen clips and memes from the show, we had some players at my table who grew up with that show and knew it very well. So right from the get-go, I didn't really know any of the deep D&D 80s cartoon lore regarding our characters and the world we were in and stuff like that, but I didn't really care about that stuff because I was more focused on learning what my Barbarian Bobby could do. But we'll talk about that in a second, because what I want to focus on right now is what using the player's handbook actually felt like during a game session in terms of looking up rules on the fly and during combat. So basically every time we had a rules related question for the dungeon master or were curious about a rule ourselves, we could find that rule that we were looking for within 30 seconds of opening the book. And the rules glossary made it very handy to quick reference rules like what actions you can take, or what are all the common abbreviations used in the book, and what are the rules for grappling again, and stuff like that. The new player's handbook is just very well organized and makes finding specific rules super easy, which is really nice for both players and dungeon masters. And when I was going back and forth between the old player's handbook and the new player's handbook, I found that I really prefer the new player's handbook when it comes to looking up features, rules, or just in general anything for that matter, because you really see how poorly organized the old one was when you compare it to the new one, or at least in my opinion. But moving on to the classes and how they played during our adventure, I played a Path of the Berserker Barbarian, and we had an Open Fist Monk, a Thief Rogue, and a Ranger who I don't remember what subclass they were in the party. And all of us were level 4. With my experience playing as the Berserker Barbarian, I gotta say that that class and subclass felt really strong, and I also gotta say that being able to maintain your rage for 10 minutes is kinda nuts, especially since all it takes to maintain your rage for those 10 minutes is either to attack an enemy make a save, or use your bonus action at the end of your turn to maintain your rage. So it's actually very easy to maintain it for those 10 minutes. So in my experience, it really felt like you got more bang for your buck with each of your rages, and on top of that, if your group ended your combat encounter and then rushed into the next encounter really quickly, you theoretically would never have to end your rage. And then the next Barbarian rule or feature that I experienced the most that I also thought was kind of nuts was that reckless attack now lasts until the start of your next turn, meaning that you get advantage on opportunity attacks, which meant that if anything tried to run away from me, yeah, it wouldn't get very far before dying. And then if you pair Reckless Attack with this next change that they made to the Berserker Barbarian, it just makes the overall class feel incredibly strong. So my rage damage bonus was a +2, meaning that I got to roll an extra 2d6 per damage roll if I was raging. So when you kind of combine all these features and rules, my level 4 Berserker Barbarian was consistently hitting my enemies and was consistently dealing like 15 points of damage every single turn. And that 15 points of damage is kind of like a low estimate in my opinion, and doesn't even include the extra damage that my really busted magic weapon was doing. And it wasn't just my class that felt really strong. All of the new classes felt pretty good in my opinion, but then again, none of the enemies we were fighting were super powerful, and the one shot gave us some pretty busted magic items to have at level 4. And while it was pretty fun to decimate our enemies with overpowered magic items, this meant that I couldn't really gauge the other classes super well during combat, which I was kind of bummed about because I couldn't see how well the the ranger was in combat because he had an absolute monster of a magical longbow. But this has just been my take and experience using the new Berserker Barbarian and some of the new 5e rules that I've come across so far. What has been your guys' experience using some of the new player classes in 5e, or have you even switched to the new rules or tried them out? Let me know in the comments down below. So what were my first impressions and thoughts regarding this new version of D&D? Well, it's basically just D&D 5e from 2014, just with stronger character classes and slightly weaker monsters. But, and this is a little annoying stinky but, despite a lot of the terminology being the same, because of how similar a lot of the rules are to the old version of 5e, it actually caused a lot of pauses during our game session where we had to double check rules to see if the rules were tweaked a little bit or if they work differently now because they have different wording or features or things like that. Like, I can't remember how many times we paused our game session, and I kind of wish I kept a tally of how many times we did, but there were a lot of times where we just had to pause our game and look up a rule regarding something that was important that was happening in our game session because we weren't sure if they had changed the wording or if it worked differently now because of new features and stuff like that. Like, you know what I mean? And some of you may hear that and think, oh, well, that's the game master's fault for not knowing the rules well enough. But as I'm sure many of you guys can relate to, when you've been playing a game system for a long time and a new version or edition of that game system comes out that slightly changes a lot of the rules, drastically changes others, and then leaves some rules completely untouched, you start to second guess yourself with what rules you're remembering. And since Pathfinder 2nd Edition was just remastered, I can kind of compare it to the new version of D&D since both game systems just essentially re-released their game just with some new rules, some tweaks to other rules, and some balancing features. But in my experience at least, I never really had as many game pauses my first time playing the Pathfinder remaster versus when I played the D&D 5e 2024 version. And I think that's mainly because the Pathfinder remaster was just them largely renaming a lot of spells, features, and rules so that they wouldn't get sued by WotC executives. But regarding my experience playing this new version of D&D 5e, I had fun. It was a great time, and like I said earlier, the game is still very much D&D 5e, just with some pretty substantial buffs to the player characters, which I don't really think they needed. But at one point during the adventure, I expressed my curiosity regarding monster stat blocks and abilities, and specifically asked our dungeon master if he had noticed any significant improvements or changes regarding that. And this may surprise you, but he said no. In fact, he said that the only real difference he's noticed, which is something that I've also noticed, was that they pretty much blanket nerfed all monsters' HP and either slightly buffed their AC or left it the same. But besides that, one other thing that's kind of nice that I've noticed about the monster stat blocks was that they combined some monsters' attacks into one ability, so that way the stat blocks are smaller. But besides that, I haven't really noticed any major changes, which I'm not gonna lie is kind of worrying, because if you consider what I was talking about earlier regarding how strong player characters feel now, then if all monsters have been nerfed in a similar way in terms of their HP being reduced and their AC maybe remaining the same or being slightly increased, which is a buff I guess, then I feel like combat encounters will just be even more player-sided than they were back in 2014. Which is fine, don't get me wrong, but I feel like as a game master and a player, it would get kind of boring after a little bit of you just completely annihilating every single combat encounter that's supposedly balanced to your level just because your character features are worlds better than any monster feature that's at your level, if that makes sense. So I guess we'll have to wait for another month until the new Dungeon Master Guide comes out, so that way we can truly start to gauge how well this game is designed and if it truly is worthy of being the final edition of D&D. But with that, everybody, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, consider leaving a like and subscribing if you want to see more content like this, or perhaps leaving a comment in regards to something I talked about in this video, or perhaps what your experience has been like using the new D&D 5e rules. But I hope to see you in the next video. Take it easy. Bye-bye.